I wish over my 30-some years as a professor I'd had more students like Russ. The diligence that he showed as a student encourages a guy like me to keep teaching. And I appreciate that. On the other hand now, Russ, I want y'all to know that in spite of what all he just said, I'm just an old Arkansas boy. Okay? And what we're going to do this morning is we're going to work on a verse in the Bible. It's very often quoted, where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there with you. Now, I don't know about you, but in that little small rural Arkansas community in which I grew up, very often the men had to be out in the fields. I mean, when the weather came and the time was right, they just had to be in the fields, which meant that a few women and some of us kids would show up at church. And someone would always quote the verse in Matthew 18:20, where two or three are gathered, I am there with you. And although there's only a few of us here tonight, why, we can go ahead and have church. And later on, as a professor, I began to look twice at that little verse. For one thing, it occurs in a sermon of Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, there are 5 sermons of Jesus. And the first one you'll know as the Sermon on the Mount. That's in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Okay, there are 2 others. And then we have chapter 18. It's a sermon. There'll be another one over toward the end of Matthew. But in this sermon in chapter 18, let me put it this way. Not a few scholars have said that it's not much of a sermon, because he hops around and skips around on this and then that and then the other, and it's almost a kind of a hodgepodge of sermon. Well, we're going to take a look at that, because I think it makes very good sense as a sermon. It opens up with Jesus answering a question that his disciples had asked him. And that question was one that just had arrogance written all over it. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Now, in other Gospels, such as the Gospel of Mark, there's an account where James and John come up to Jesus. Who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus just jumps all over those boys for that. He says in the account in Mark, he says, I just cannot grant that. They were looking at the kingdom Jesus was going to build this way. The Jews, 10 centuries earlier, under King David and Solomon, had built an empire that was more powerful than the Egyptians down to the southwest and the Assyrians over to the east. They had developed trade routes that went all the way from the Arabic Gulf down there up to the Mediterranean. And they were the ones that started importing spices from the Far East that came by ship, overland, up through the Arabian Peninsula, right through Jerusalem, and on up toward the Mediterranean Sea at Tyre and so on, and shipped it over toward the west with Greece and Italy. And because of that spice route, they grew fantastically wealthy. Solomon built a temple that they said was unrivaled in the ancient world. That trade route had forts built on it about every 20 miles, all the way from the Gulf up to the Mediterranean, to protect the supply route from marauders that might come from the side. I've seen a couple of those forts, and the report from the ancient world is that sometimes the camel caravans carrying those spices would take 7 days for one caravan to pass a given fort. We're talking about a lot of trade and a lot of wealth. and a lot of power. It was to their temple that the Syrians in the north cut the cedars of Lebanon and brought them down. It was to their temple that people from faraway nations brought tribute by the wagon loads, gold and silver and precious stones and so on. The kingdom under King David was fantastic. But then you know how the people grew rather arrogant with all of that wealth, and how over the next 2 or 3 centuries they began to lose their bearings about God, what was right, and they became in many ways even worse than the nations round about them. And it wasn't long before the people from the Far East grew more powerful than them, and their armies came over and conquered them, took them as captives over to the Far East, and for a long time they were there. When they came back from the Far East, they talked about how once they had the glory, and they wanted that glory again. And there came to be a talk about a coming kingdom. And that kingdom talk began to snowball. We're going to have another kingdom. Someone's going to come and help us do that. They even came up with the idea that Moses would come back from the dead and help them. Elijah would come back from the dead and help them. There would be a coming one who would help them, a Messiah. There would be a prophet to come from the past who would help them. It wasn't one view. It was just a bunch of different views that we're going to get this kingdom back. Someday, someone is going to come and lead our people against these Romans who have conquered us. And we're going to kick the Romans out of our country. And that person is going to set himself up on a new throne in Jerusalem. And we'll have a new temple. And we'll have a new Jewish kingdom right there in Jerusalem. And the disciples are a part of all of that expectation. And when Jesus comes along, he, in the Gospel of Matthew, he heals a man in chains, berserk, running around in a cemetery spooking people. But Jesus spends time with them, and the guy is left there sitting, fully clothed for the first time in a long time, and having a normal conversation with people for the first time in years. Jesus brought that man back into life. And shortly after that, you have a couple of guys who could not hear. You have people who can't speak, people who can't see. You have lame people, all kind of people who had no hope in life, run into this man from Nazareth, and all of a sudden their life is completely turned around. But Jesus confuses these disciples who follow him. Their question time and again is, why are you wasting time with these losers? Why are you wasting time with these people who have nothing to contribute? We cannot conquer the Romans in Jerusalem with a bunch of deaf and blind and lame people. That woman who had the blood disease for years cannot contribute one thing to what we're going to do in Jerusalem. Why are you wasting your time is essentially their question. And more than once, Jesus gets on to the disciples when the little children come running around him, and they shoo the little children away because they have no value to what they think is going to happen. You can't whip the Romans with a bunch of street urchins. These little nameless, faceless kids, many of whom have no home to go to at night, they have scroungy clothes. They haven't taken a bath in weeks. What in the world are you doing with these little kids? Okay. So in Matthew chapter 18, verse 1, the question, who is going to be the greatest in the kingdom, has nothing to do with church. It won't even come along for quite some time. It's a purely Jewish question, growing out of all of those years of Jewish expectations of a kingdom that's going to come in Jerusalem. Who's going to be the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War? Who's going to run this government? I'd kind of like to be vice president myself, you know. These guys have no concern for the people with whom Jesus has been spending these 3 years all over the hills and the valleys of that ancient land. They only have in mind this kingdom. So Jesus in verse 2 calls a little street urchin to the middle of the bunch. And he says in verse 3, I'm going to tell you people something. If you don't change your thinking and become like this little kid, you won't even see the kingdom. Now, there are some translations of the New Testament which kind of turn this into, if you don't turn and believe in God. But in the Greek Bible, the word God is not there. It's just change your ways. So I'm going to suggest this has nothing to do with believing in God. This has to do with changing your attitude toward people, because that's what the whole sermon is going to be about. And if you throw God in there, you turn it into a belief matter, which is a different thing. Let's leave it the way the text goes. He's talking about the value of a little child and says if you don't change your attitude to become like this little child, you won't see the kingdom. And from there he goes on in verse 4, whoever humbles himself like a little child, this one is going to be the greatest in the kingdom. And that causes us to ponder, what is there about a little street urchin, a little nameless, faceless kid who doesn't count? What is there about that little child that Jesus wants these disciples to become like? Now there we can let our minds wander. It might be this, it might be that, and your idea might be just as good as anyone else's about what it is to be like a little child. But as I've wandered through the backside of Africa and the jungles of Guatemala, and you see these little kids, what is there about a little child like that you would have to applaud? And for me, purely personal opinion, has nothing to do with the Bible. It's innocence. They haven't yet been corrupted. They haven't become jungle fighters. They haven't yet become people who raid other tribes and kill them for what kind of salt they can get and so on. They haven't been like the people in the backside of Africa that go over and kill their neighbor because they want to take his cow because he belongs to another tribe and it's okay to kill him. They haven't yet gotten to that kind of a screwed up world. In a way, it's almost like these guys who have this, we want to kill the Romans, we want to build this kingdom, we want to play politics in Jerusalem, we want to be this and that and the other. And these little children haven't yet gotten involved in all of that, which one might call garbage. Their innocence is what I see. And what you see might be just as good as what I see. The text doesn't say. It just says that they need to get rid of this arrogance, all of this I count, and I want to be one of those that count the most. And he says, I want you to get rid of that. Okay. Now verse 5. Whoever receives one of these little children in my name receives me. If they have been shooing them away, he simply says, whoever would get down on a knee and talk to this little kid and treat him like a human being, whoever would help him get some clothes, help him find some food, maybe help him find a place to spend the night, maybe even have a blanket to cover with. Whoever would receive one of these little kids receives me. Now at verse 6, in many translations, there's a paragraph break and you start into something else that talks about being tempted to sin. That was put in there by people who translated. That's not in the text. The text continues straight on whoever offends one of these little ones, and there's no paragraph break, whoever receives one receives me, but whoever offends one of these little ones. He said, I'm going to tell you people something. It would be better that you put a big rock around his neck, tie a rope on it, and throw that guy in a lake. I have to make the statement. If you want to know what Jesus' view of child abuse is, comes pretty close, don't you think? He would just say there's no place in a civilized society for child abuse. And my disciples are not going to treat these little kids with any kind of disrespect. You accept them. You bring them along. That's a pretty strong statement. It's not the kind of thing we like to hear from Jesus of Nazareth. He's supposed to go around singing pietistic little songs and handing out flowers in the marketplace. I don't know what your view of Jesus is, but one of the things I appreciate him about it is when sin rears an ugly head, he pointed a finger at it and he did not blink. That's bad. And here's how we deal with it. Now, I don't know whether Jesus would have tied that knot around that guy's neck. It's kind of hard for me to imagine a Jesus that would have done that. So is he speaking metaphorically? Yeah. Here's the text. Let's just live with it this week. You don't treat little kids that way. Woe, verse 7 says, to whoever offends. Now at that point in some translation, another paragraph comes. And it turns the topic into temptation to sin. It is not there. It's not in there. It goes right on from what we've been talking about offending. Woe to whoever offends people. Woe to whoever offends people. Woe to whoever, what verse 7 almost says that twice, doesn't it? Now, in the context of offending people, we offend in different ways, don't we? Probably, if the writer of the little epistle of James is right, we do it most with this. But we can offend with a fist. We can offend with a foot. We can offend with all kinds of things. So he says, look, if it's your hand that offends, better to cut that thing off and find out what it is to live right than to find your way to eternal torment because you couldn't control that little thing. And I don't know, when I was growing up, I thought it was just a hand. But as I've wandered around this old world, I think it's that kind of hand. Woe to whoever offense comes. And then he says, what if your eye offends you? Better to pluck that eye out and cast it from you. Hey, I have been a teenage boy. One eye won't do it, people. One eye won't do it. There was a 3rd century church father by the name of Origen who decided that it wasn't his eye, it was another member of his body, and he cut that off. And he went down to the desert in Egypt and became one of those desert monks. He said, my pillow was a rock and my friends were scorpions. But I could not forget the dancing girls of Rome. So you cut your hand off or you throw your eye out. It's a figure of speech. You can't cut your hand off because you still got another fist and 2 good feet. And you still have that tongue. So his point here is that whatever you have that offends, you can understand it would be better to get rid of that. Let's put offense in another way. Suppose I had a cancer there. not slugging people, have a cancer. I'd go to a doctor and get that thing cut off so that it didn't spread and get the rest of me. If I had an eye that was cancerous, I'd go to a doctor and get that thing surgically removed so that it doesn't get the rest of me. And I think what he's talking about here is whatever there is in you guys, these disciples, you have to find a way to get rid of that just like a surgeon would. You have to cut it out and get it removed from you. Now in verse 10, we have another paragraph break, and we bring up this thing about, a parable about a guy who had 100 sheep. What has that got to do with anything? You know, and that's why scholars are saying, he talks about little kids. He talks about cutting your eye out. Now he's talking about a wandering sheep and whatnot. And they say, what a sermon. I even had a speech professor in college who said he would give this a D- as a sermon. Okay. Let's talk about this parable of lost sheep and what it's doing in this sermon. Goes down through verse 14. Is he still talking in verse 10 about those little children? Certainly. That's the point all the way through here. These little children have value. And you're going to get rid of whatever you need to get rid of so that you can treat these little children as human beings. And then he says, these little kids actually have somebody up there watching out for them. You need to know about that. They're not just little faceless, or they have somebody up there watching out for them. Now, what do you think? If a guy has 100 sheep, one of them wanders away, what would you do? Well, it's a good thing he didn't ask me. I grew up in Arkansas and we weren't sheep people. You ever smell one? I mean, have you ever smelled a wet sheep? I would say let the fool thing go. Maybe it'll take some others off with it. I'm not a sheep person. But now, look, they were, in their society, sheep had tremendous value all over that ancient Near Eastern world. Wherever you go out there in that Arabian desert, people will be herding sheep. The last time I was over there down in southern Jordan, there was a little girl. I'm estimating she was probably 10 years old or so. And they would be gone 4 or 5 days at a time out there with the sheep to find the grass they needed. And this little girl was out there by herself all that time. And I asked one of the Arabian guys that I was with, how in the world is this little girl like? I wouldn't let my daughter or my granddaughter go out there for love or money. And he said, let me tell you this. If anything happened to that little girl, her family would kill 4 generations of the family of the person that did it. Great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and all the kids. And he said they would probably go after the cousins. It's the way they do justice in that part of the world. So he said, that's probably the safest little girl you've ever seen. So she's out there with those sheep. But sheep in a culture like that have tremendous value. It's not just like we raised rabbits and, hey, if you lose a rabbit or two, no sweat. Every sheep has tremendous value. So when a sheep wanders away, the obvious point here is everybody drops what they're doing and a bunch of people go search for the sheep. Not just this guy. Friends and neighbors are going to help because that sheep has value. Okay, so you would stop everything you're doing and you would go out in the rain and the whatever and you'd look for a sheep, but that little child has no value? I mean, he throws this in pretty bold relief. You're putting a human being up against a sheep? And then in verse 15, he moves away from the little children to the adult world. What about you guys if someone offends you, or your brother offends you? By brother there, it doesn't mean your literal brother. It doesn't mean your Christian brother. It means somebody. In verse 15. Somebody offends you. What do? Well, let's be honest with one another. What do you do when you get ticked off with somebody? You know? Don't we? You don't want to be around them. You don't want them around you. You show up at the supermarket. You're going to walk that aisle instead of this one, so you don't even have to look at them. I mean, what do we do when we get ticked off? Hey, let's be honest. Okay, it's broken. And we don't want to deal with it. So he said that what you really need to do, if you're a follower of me, is you go talk to that person. Okay, that sounds simple. I think the most difficult step I have ever taken in life is the first step towards somebody I don't like. That is one difficult step to take. But once you take the first one, it's a little bit easier to take the second one and go ahead and do it. I told a story yesterday about teaching in a university some years ago with an individual with whom I disagreed on almost everything. I think if two dogs were fighting, we'd pick different dogs. We just differed on a lot. Well, an incident cropped up in which I was involved, and it really ticked him off. So he stomped in the building where we were the next day, and it was an old Victorian mansion, a Georgian mansion, and I heard his footsteps. Boom, 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 boom. Oh, he was ticked off. Went up to his office, and I know this text and what it says. I believe it. It's in the Bible. But it simply says, you go take the first step and try to get it right. Now, he ticked you off. But you take the first step. So, how are you going to look a generation of young guys like Russ in the face and say, now here's what it teaches, and I ain't going to do it? So you got to do it. You bite the bullet. You walk over to his office and you knock on the door. And as I said yesterday, your knees are shaking. Your voice is a little bit higher because when you're around somebody you don't like, you're different, aren't you? You'll talk harder. You'll talk faster. You'll talk louder. You know, you are physiologically different when you're around somebody you don't like. And I said, Well, we talked for a while, and we agreed that we disagreed on a bunch of stuff, but we would go out and eat lunch. Now, my students didn't like his students, and his students didn't like my students. But from that day on, they had to deal with the fact that these two guys are eating lunch together. And that was one powerful thing for them to have to deal with. That first step out behind my desk to go talk to that man was, I believe, the most difficult step I'd taken in life to that point. But let's just admit now, Jesus says, go talk to him and make it right. Now, the second thing comes in verse 16. If he hears you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen to you, what do? Oh, I tried. That clown didn't. I tried. So, okay. I gave it my best shot. And Jesus says, that's not the way to go. You find somebody to go with you. Find an intermediary to help sort it out. Sometimes a calm third person can help put oil on the water, and I've been that person. On occasion, I've been one of the ones that the third person had to deal with. You know, sometimes we just need somebody to help sort it out. A calm voice, a reasonable voice to say, well, let's just kind of back off and look at this. Well, if he hears the mediator, now what do? Well, that's good. We've gained our brother. We've solved the problem. But what happens if he doesn't listen? Whew, boy, did I ever go the third mile here. I went the 10th mile. I even took somebody in there with me to help sort it out. And Jesus says, no. Actually, the text here says, take it to the church. Let me tell you people something. I'm not going to bring my dirty laundry in front of y'all. You know. So what does he mean here? Why, I don't know, in just a general audience, maybe not everybody in the whole church needs to know about that. But a larger group of fellow Christians, fellow believers, should help sort it out, Matthew says. You know, that perhaps the elders, perhaps whatever. I don't know that we need to say here, what you need to do when you have a personal problem is come up here in front of the church and get the mic and just let all this stuff out. I'm not thinking that's what this is about. What he's saying is you need a large, if one intermediary can't do it, maybe a larger group can help sort this thing out. Okay. Only after you've gone that far does he say at the end of this verse, you treat him like a jerk. Now, that's the literal translation of the Greek. No, it's not. Treat him like a heathen and a publican. We don't even talk about heathen and publicans. Most of us don't know what a publican is. Kind of a long-billed bird in New Orleans or something. Treat him like a jerk. Well, I don't know that Jesus is giving a point by point here where you can finally get to the point where you do that to a person. But he's saying you go further than we normally do. And then you go further than you normally do. And see if there's any possible way. Because the person has value. Not just those little urchins we were talking about, but these people that tick us off. They have value. And let's do whatever we can to... This is a sermon on repairing broken relationships. It's a sermon on helping relationships to work. Now, in verse 18, I'm going to tell you this. Whatever is bound on earth will be bound in heaven. What's loosed on earth will be loosed in heaven. What's that got to do with anything? All right. In verse 18, let's assume that there's an intermediary working between us here. No, let's assume I'm the intermediary. That's a better story. Let's assume I'm the intermediary, and I've got a man and a woman in here, and they're having marital troubles. And it's got so bad, they're shouting at one another, and maybe even throwing things at one another. I've seen that happen. I mean, this thing is breaking down big time. What's a little guy like me going to do? What in the world can you do? Well, what I have found out is you can't solve the problem, but you can get one thing maybe to work. If you can get him to make one promise to her about something that ticks her off, and if he can keep that promise, there's at least one thing she has to admit she appreciates about him. So, he's going to say, I am not going to leave my old muddy boots on the floor when I come in from hunting anymore. If that ticks you off, I will not do that. So he makes a promise. Now, you turn to her. He really doesn't like all that stuff hanging up in the bathroom. Now, will you promise to hang it up somewhere else so he doesn't walk through all this stuff when he's in the bathroom? And she'll say, yeah, that's what he wants. But she makes a promise. Now, each of them has just made a promise. Now, what happens that next week when they come back in? They still don't like one another. But now there's one thing that each of them has to admit that they appreciate about the other one. So then you find something else. And you add it in for the next week. The only way to repair that relationship is to keep doing little things that the other one appreciates. That's the only way I know how you can do this. So I think what he's saying is, we're still in the context of repairing broken relationships. If you make a promise to the other person in repairing this thing, you keep that binding. Like you made the promise to them, Jesus said, you count that as a promise you made to God too. If it's bound here, it's bound there, Jesus says. This is not just a little agreement you made. You made that agreement before God. You keep that promise. Years ago, I taught at Pepperdine University. We had more, over my 30-some years, I've heard more graduation speeches than you can point a stick at. Most of them not worth remembering. But I was out at Pepperdine, and we had Charlton Heston was going to give the speech there for the graduation. I mean, for you young ones, you may not know the movie, The Ten Commandments, Oscar-winning, movie of the year years ago, about Moses delivering. Charlton Heston wasn't Charlton Heston. He was Moses, you know. And I couldn't wait. Moses is coming to speak to us. Well, they gave this flowery thing like you did, overdid it like you did. Moses gets up there. And he stands beside the lectern, and I'm going to quote his speech. He said, "Young people, you don't have to make a promise, but if you do, keep it. Your world will be better, and so will mine." And he sat down. That's it. And I thought, man, I've been rooked. Moses was here. And all we got was this. But if you think about that, wouldn't the world be better if we just kept our promises? You know? And what Jesus is saying here is, if you're going to repair a broken relationship and you make an agreement in that, you keep that promise. Now look at verse 19. Again, I say, any two of you get together and ask God for, He will give it to you. Now, when I was a little kid, I built a radio set in the Boy Scouts. And the job was to pick up the local radio station, KXJK, about 8 or 10 miles down the road. I picked up New York City. I did. And there was a guy on the radio they called Reverend Ike. And Reverend Ike was preaching a sermon to people saying, if you can, out of this verse, if you just get a Bible-believing, God-fearing brother or sister to pray with you, whatever you pray for, God will give it to you. A Cadillac? You want a $10,000 bill to fall in your lap? Whatever you pray for, just send Reverend Ike 10%. And the guy was a multimillionaire, I found out later, because people were sending in stuff. And the only thing he preached, I found out later, was that one verse. And he got that wrong. Jesus is not saying whatever you want, pray for it, and God will give it to you. Now, wouldn't that just be a bed of roses for us? He's in a sermon about repairing broken relationships. And who is this other one that's going to help you pray? You know. And the prayer is about this relationship. Not whatever. If you pray about this relationship with a brother, God's now involved in this. And you don't want to solve broken relationships on your own. You want God involved in it. And now comes verse 20. Where any 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there with you. What's the context? Repairing broken relationships. Getting people back together. Where any 2, most of us have to have 2 to have a fuss. Some of us only need 1. But most of us have to have 2 to have a good fuss. Who is the 3? The intermediary. He's still talking about what he's been talking about all the way through the sermon. When people get bent out of shape, we need to get that repaired. And he's saying wherever there's 2 or 3 people trying to get something repaired, Jesus said, I'm involved in that. I'm interested in that. Yeah? And then he doesn't change the sermon. Look what happens in verse 21. Peter pipes up and says, oh, Lord, how often should we forgive people? 7 times? And you know how we read that. Oh, Peter, you jerk. It ought to be 70 times 7. You know. Hey, if you don't like somebody, 1 is a big number. If you don't like them, have you ever gone back 7 times? I'm talking about for us, 7 is beyond imagination if you don't like them. And that's his whole point here. How often do you want God to forgive you when you tick Him off? Let's get that up there higher than most people from Arkansas can count. Now, I can make fun of that state. Y'all better not. How often do you want God to forgive you when you tick Him off? We want an open door, don't we? We don't want a limit on that one. And thankfully, there's not. If the rest of the New Testament is right, you can keep walking back in that one as often as you need to. You know? You can fuss with God like Jesus did in the Garden of Gethsemane. For 3 hours he was fussing with God. It's okay to do that. Like the book of Hebrews says, you just keep coming. You just keep on that path. Thankfully, there is no upper number. How often should you then be working with people that tick you off? In verses 21 down through 35, you have a parable told. A guy owed a huge amount of money. Now, we don't know what 100 talents is and all that sort of stuff. Some translations will even say he owed $10 million. I don't know. More than most of us will ever get. Okay? He owed that debt. He couldn't pay it. Thrown into prison. He begs the ruler not to throw him into debtor's prison. Back in those days, if you couldn't pay, they threw you in prison. It doesn't make good sense because if you're in there, you can't make any money to pay him off anyway. But they'd throw you in. Sometimes they'd throw the whole family in there with them. That was just the way they did it. He says, don't do that to me. And after kind of begging off, the master sort of wrote off the debt. Just wrote it off. He went out of that very building, and on the way out of the building ran into a fellow slave that owed him a very small, and he had that guy thrown into prison. And when all of that scandal got out and got back to the master, he reversed things. He let the guy out of prison that owed the small debt. And he put the guy that owed the big debt back in prison. And look how this sermon ends in verse 35. That's what my Father in heaven's going to do to you unless you start forgiving people from the bottom of your heart. Getting it together. The conclusion of Jesus' sermon is, we're talking about some serious stuff here for you if you don't get it together. Now, all the way through the Gospel of Matthew, we have, from the ending of the Sermon on the Mount on, how important people are. And here in this sermon, one of the 5 sermons of Jesus that we have is on forgiving other people. How important is that? So I'm going to leave you with, first of all, my gratitude to Russ for being here this morning and meeting you fine people. But I'm going to leave you with a prayer that if this week you need to take a first step towards somebody, it'd be a good week to do it.